Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Fadia AlBuhairan will defend the academic thesis, Adolescents in Saudi Arabia, Their Status of Health. I'd like to welcome everybody. I'd like to welcome the supervising team, Professor De Vries from Maastricht University and Professor Makzoub from the United Arab Emirates University. I also like to welcome the members of the Corona, who I will introduce later on. And of course, I'd like to welcome the PhD candidate. Fadia AlBuhairan, may I invite you now to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, highly esteemed pro-rector, highly esteemed members of the Corona, highly esteemed supervisor and co-supervisor, my dearest family, friends, and audience. Over the next 15 minutes, I will be speaking about adolescents in Saudi Arabia and their status of health. I'll be starting by giving a brief introduction, followed by the methodology applied, the key findings, the conclusions, and finally, some of the implications. So adolescents today comprise the largest cohort in history. We have 1.2 billion adolescents aged 10 to 19 years in the world today, making up 16% of the world's population. There are different proportions in the different regions of the world, with about 17% in the Middle East, North Africa region. In Saudi Arabia, 14% of our population are adolescents. In fact, about 50% of the population in Saudi Arabia is below 30 years of age. The importance of this is that it presents as the opportunity for a demographic dividend, meaning the potential economic opportunity for the country, considering the young age structure that we have, the larger workforce and the lower dependency ratio. In order to achieve this demographic dividend, though, education are crucial, and so is health. This is important to achieve before we become an aging population, which is expected to happen by 2050. So it really is important that we take advantage of the current demographic structure and act now. Adolescents, or investing in adolescents, is known to have multiple advantages. In fact, we know that investing in adolescents has a triple dividend. It has it's a positive outcome for adolescents themselves, for their future adult health, and also for future generations to come. The burden of disease in Saudi Arabia is highly attributable to non-communicable diseases. So the top causes of disability-adjusted life years in the country are because of cardiovascular disease, musculoskeletal disorders, mental disorders, which have risen up in the rankings, diabetes, kidney diseases, other non-communicable diseases, as well as injuries. When we look at the top risk factors or years living with disability in Saudi Arabia, we see that the commonest causes or commonest risk factors, I should say, are high body mass index, as well as high fasting glucose, drug use, dietary risks, and others. The burden of disease in countries is driving the healthcare and research agendas. However, they continue to be driving these agendas in more of a reactive approach rather than a proactive approach, meaning there is a lot of focus or attention given to curing or treating these conditions, maybe to a lesser extent controlling some of these diseases, but certainly a lot less when it comes to prevention. It's important to address these because we know that 70% of premature adult death is due to behaviors that begin in adolescence. And that's where the linkage or the importance of linking these two things together comes. We have scarce adolescent health data in the country, and the focus tends to be either child or adult approach or focus, with that age cutoff being 12 to 14 years. In other words, we don't have disaggregated data on adolescents, and henceforth, we cannot really address or know what their needs are. These are some of the reasons that led me to conceiving this national study, GILUNA, which in Arabic means our generation. So the aim of this thesis aims at exploring the following amongst adolescents in Saudi Arabia, exploring their health risk behaviors and their health status, their perceptions of body image and weight loss amongst underweight adolescents, the predictors of symptoms suggestive to depression and anxiety, the relationships between bullying, physical violence, and mental health and academic performance, the association between exposure to media and substance use, as well as the prevalence of sleep deprivation and its associated factors. Again, most of these items are items that we saw in the burden of disease in adults, with the exception maybe of sleep deprivation, which is not included there. So we applied a cross-sectional school-based design. It was observational. This was conducted in 2011-2012 in all 13 regions of Saudi Arabia, with the multi-stage cluster random sampling technique applied. All intermediate and secondary schools in the country that functioned during the day were eligible to participate. And data was collected by three means: by a self-administered questionnaire, which addressed health with that comprehensive approach, meaning a biopsychosocial lens, addressing items related to their biological or their health, physical conditions, their mental health, and their social, conditions. Clinical anthropometric measurements were taken by trained staff, and blood was sampled for blood investigations later on. Data was analyzed, and weighting of the data was conducted in order to ensure national representation of the sample. And finally, institutional review board approval, the Ministry of Education approval, parental consent, and adolescent assent were all obtained prior to beginning the study. The key findings are as follows. First of all, we had over 12,500 participants who are student participants in the study. We had a more or less balanced gender participation, and 87% of participants were Saudi, which is very much in keeping with the proportion of the overall population. Some of the key risk behaviors are what we see on the table on the right, but basically we found that adolescents were engaging in unhealthy dietary behaviors, lack of physical activity, unsafe traffic safety behaviors. About 1 in 4 were exposed to bullying or some other sort of violence. There was some evidence of tobacco and substance use. Mental health was not uncommon, with about twice the ratio in girls as compared to boys. Only half of the population had a healthy weight, with about 30% either being overweight or obese and the others being underweight, and approximately half of the population was sleep deprived. The different chapters addressed we looked in-depth analysis for the different health issues that we addressed in the various chapters. But really and we got a better understanding of what are the associated factors, what are the predictors, and so on. But to me, I find that the key finding from all of this is that when we looked at some of the adolescent health issues, which are showing here in red, and their associated factors, which show here in blue, there is so much interconnection, interrelationship between all of these various things. And the message here really is that in order to address, we cannot address one item without addressing the others. And so that holistic lens or approach to them is very essential. With this, we were able to conclude that adolescents in Saudi Arabia engage in unhealthy behaviors with some existing gender differences or disparities. The biopsychosocial health conditions are prevalent to varying extents among adolescents in Saudi Arabia. And again, linking this with what we saw with the current burden of disease in adults provides much concern to the overall population health of the country, considering the potential negative impacts on adolescents themselves and their future adult health. The interrelationships between the present health conditions and their associated factors are intertwined and complex, really necessitating the need for us to view them with a broad or holistic lens. What sort of implications does this have? This research has generated national level evidence to support decision-making with respect to guiding policy development, programming, and services. A life course lens as well as a holistic lens. And I tend to refer to this as a 3D lens that we need to use in order to address health is required. 3D meaning in the sense that life course or longitudinal, and that holistic biopsychosocial, horizontally and across the different levels at the micro, meso, and the macro levels is really necessary. Surveillance of the status of adolescent health will also support identifying the impact of the efforts and will continuously inform us of the changing needs and the dynamics of society that will further support us to intervene and translate in a timely manner. And finally, wide-scale capacity building, both among professionals as well as parents, is required to support the above. With that, I conclude. I thank you for your attention, and I give the word back to the Prorector. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your clear presentation. We will now start with the opposition, and the opposition will be opened by Professor Kremers, Professor of Health Promotion at this university. Professor Kremers.
Thank you. Dear candidate, first of all, my congratulations for the great work that you've done and the very interesting series of studies that you have presented in your thesis. It must have been quite a challenge to do this, especially in the context of Saudi Arabia. So this is, I think, really worth a compliment. But obviously, I didn't only attend this meeting to provide you with compliments. I also have some questions. And my questions relate to chapter 7. In chapter 7, you study the relationship between media use and substance use. And I think that's a very interesting and relevant study that you did, but I have some questions related to that, and let's go through them together. Let me start with the measures that you've used in your questionnaire. And there appears, or there seems to be a disconnection between the operationalization of smoking behavior and the operationalization of the substance use. For smoking behavior, you have operationalized ever use as an indicator of smoking, while for substances, you have operationalized using it in the past month. Can you explain to me why you have used for these, why you have chosen for these operationalizations?
Thank you very much, my highly esteemed opponent, for your question and for your compliments. First of all, you're absolutely right. We did use a different sort of approach when it came to tobacco use and other forms of substance use. The reason being that with tobacco use, anecdotally, it's definitely more readily available. We tend to think that adolescents might, at least in our context here, might experiment with cigarette smoking much more, than they would with other sorts of substances. And so we did not find that it would be, from a contextual perspective, equal to say, to address both in the same context. And it's for that reason, really, that for tobacco, it was ever use versus the past month and the other substances. Having said that, with the smoking, we addressed both actually, every use in addition to the past month, because we wanted to be able to differentiate whether it was just experimentation that took place with the tobacco versus a more regular or habitual experience.
Yes. So you have assessed smoking in the past month in your questionnaire. I saw that you have included, I think, 22 questions about smoking and substance use in your questionnaire. So there was a question related to smoking in the past month, but you chose not to use that one. That's interesting, because I think one of the assumptions in underlying this particular study is that media use and smoking are related. You know, there's always, you know, especially in cross-sectional research, this question about the chicken or the egg, right? And if you assessed ever smoking, so ever even used one puff of a cigarette, is of course totally different in terms of causality when you look at media use at present time, in contrast to, you know, smoking while gaming, for example. So why did you not use the current smoking status in this study?
So in terms of we thought that it's a good, you know, argument that you present here, but we did think that, considering the fact that, you know, again, it was much more common for adolescents to have ever used tobacco, we wanted to have this longer view, or this sort of a bigger picture, you know, assessment of the item. So it's really for that reason that we decided, I guess there wasn't really a right or wrong approach to do it, but we did elect, you know, after discussion, that it would probably be best for us to address it in terms of ever use for this particular item.
Okay, and have you run analyses using the current smoking assessment? Were there differences?
I don't have that. I cannot recall really at this moment whether we ran the specific for the current use, but I do recall that we, you know, we did address whether we should be using this or that, and realize that it would be, in considering the prevalence of the ever use, to use that for this condition.
Okay. So let's go on. I promised that I had some questions, or multiple questions on this interesting study. You may be aware of this idea of clustering. Have you ever heard of clustering? So that, you know, substance use, for example, alcohol consumption tends to co-occur with smoking behavior, for example. So we call that clustering. And that's of course very relevant if you want to see how factors are related to each other. And I saw in your regression analyses you have chosen to correct for multiple confounders, but in those confounders you did not include, let's say, the other dependent variable. So in your analysis for smoking, you did not correct for substance use, for example, and for substance use you did not correct for smoking, while maybe in the light of the co-occurrence of those behaviors that might have been plausible. So I'm interested in your line of reasoning there.
Thank you. That's a great question. We're actually in the process of conducting some analyses based on clustering, for this exact reason, that there might be some, you know, and especially with some of the findings and that interrelationships that we found, we do believe that there might be further effects that were not showing up in the analysis that we did conduct. And so that is currently ongoing analysis that is being performed.
And any slight indications of the results of those analyses?
So yes, so it looks like, I mean, things are showing up in clusters, you know, again, not surprising results, to be honest with you, but, you know, individuals or adolescents who engage, for example, in poor dietary behaviors were also the ones who are engaging in poor or lack of physical activity or increased, you know, sedentary lifestyle. Clustering around, you know, the tobacco substance use and some of the mental health, you know, issues. So the items that seem that you would expect to appear have been appearing in some of that preliminary analysis. because it's still ongoing, I don't want to, make any concluding remarks, but we're definitely seeing these clustering, patterns showing up.
And wouldn't it then be useful or good or appropriate to correct for those clustered behaviors in your logistic regressions?
Yes, I think they would be.
So what would be your hypothesis if you would have done that? How would that impact on the results?
So I don't think there would have been too much of a difference, meaning that, the main findings, I believe, would continue to be the same. I don't think there would be too much of a difference. If we looked at, for example, the bullying or the physical violence and the mental health, would it have changed much? No, I don't think so. When we looked at the weight status and some of those behaviors, would it have changed much? Again, I don't think so. I think we would have more, maybe prominent, results, if you will. But in terms of the key findings, I don't expect that they would be different.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I think those are very intriguing, interesting analyses that are going to follow. Having said that, I thank you for your answer, and I give the word back to the prorector.
Thank you very much, Professor Kremers. The opposition will be continued by Professor Blom from Johns Hopkins University, Bloomberg School of Public Health in Baltimore in the United States. Professor Blom, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity. I'd like to start out by asking you, the candidate, to talk a little bit about doing this study. First of all, doing a study on adolescents in a national survey is not just an academic exercise. It's a political exercise as well. Talk a bit about, first of all, what was the politics of getting this accepted? Second, what was the acceptance once it was accepted? What was the refusal rate of parents who didn't want their kids to participate or kids who didn't participate? And then third, what has been the reception of some of these findings? Where have you seen pushback from whether it's ministries or government or schools or young people or parents themselves?
Thank you, your highly esteemed opponent, for this very loaded question. So to begin with, yes, I mean, this study was not done for academic purposes, for pure academic purposes. There was a much bigger, objective really in mind. And this was looking at driving the national agenda towards providing, first of all, acknowledging that we have adolescents in our population because they have been neglected to a very large extent. As I mentioned earlier, the focus has primarily been children or adults, and a child magically becomes an adult at a certain age. So they've been off, they have not been on the radar. And this was really very much, I noticed this when I was still in medical school and when I was conducting my internal medicine rotations and would walk into a hospital room, a patient room or a shared room with 4 patients, and 3 out of the 4 patients were elderly gentlemen, and the 4th patient was a 14 or 15-year-old young boy. And it was, this is really where it was clear to me that there was something wrong with how we were addressing things. So it was really, the purpose of this was to acknowledge that we do have adolescents in our country. They do have different, or they have their own needs, which we must address. And in order to be able to, make an impact or to inform policy and programming, we really need to have the evidence to support this, as opposed to, it's just personal opinion or having evidence or literature from other parts of the world coming in to inform what we need to do in the country. In terms of the process of having this study conducted, and prior to conducting it, getting the necessary approvals, the IRB approval as an example, which was a lengthy process, which is not unusual, for many IRBs, maybe globally. However, there was some pushback when it came to addressing certain topics. An example was pushback when it came to addressing tobacco and substance use, because some people had the opinion that we don't want to put these thoughts in kids' minds. So there was those sort of discussions. There were other topics that I made a conscious choice not to address, because I knew it would be very, very challenging at this point to get approvals. And so at the end of the day, we did receive the IRB approval for the proposal as I had conceived it, without any changes. Lots of back and forth, lots of rebuttals, but it was approved. The Ministry of Education was very, very supportive. So meaning at the highest level of the Ministry of Education, a lot of support. When it came down to the school levels, because we also requested approval from the schools, again, the great majority of schools accepted. There was very few exceptions where they were just absolutely not interested in having this, done at their schools. And so the school response rate was quite high. When we got down to the family level, or the parent and adolescent level, the response rate there was about 33%. So it was lower. It's much lower in comparison to the school's participation or response rate. However, not unusual when it comes to large scale surveys. In terms of the findings thereafter and the perception of the different stakeholders, it's I think I would say it's somewhat positive, meaning positive in the sense that, okay, it's great that we actually have evidence now at the country level to tell us what is the status, to tell us what are the needs, with the recommendations for the different stakeholders. When you talk to, when I talk to parents and families, again, it's they're very welcoming. Because parents are parents, we will always worry as parents. And for them, they're quite happy that we are wanting to address some of these things with their young children and their adolescents. In terms of the uptake and the implementation, this is really where it's really been quite slow. There has been some uptake, so I can say that adolescent health has finally come onto the national research agenda just last year. So it is identified as one of the core areas of research in the country. In terms of implementation when it comes to like the healthcare perspective, I was just in talks with some colleagues yesterday about the age limits and trying to push forward, the age limits so that it is consistent across the country, especially since we do have a Child Protection Act, which defines children as anyone below 18 years of age. And when it comes to the public health, agenda, I think we're still a little bit slow. We're again trying to work on school health and uptake of, some of these very important topics in schools and, where adolescents are spending a lot of their time. So there is some uptake, I would say, certainly not as quickly as I would hope to see, but at least heading in the right direction, I would say.
Thank you. In the interest of time, let me turn quickly to chapter 5 and mental health. You tied your questions on depression to the DSM, but the DSM and the diagnosis of depression requires reaching a certain threshold. What we know about adolescents is that much of their mental health distress is subclinical. Would you use the same measures today as you did a decade ago for depression? And if not, what would you want to look at today?
Thank you very much. So, yes and no. I would continue to use some of the, the DSM criteria or factors there. However, I would, considering the changes in society and the dynamic changes in society, there are other factors that, might appear that would reflect this. Items, considering the digital age and kids spending a lot of time, online, things related to, their cyber life, if you will. Considering the COVID and the pandemic and how that has impacted our lives, some aspects of some social aspects again would have changed, and we would need to address them there. Again, the wording, maybe some of the wording that is maybe less abstract to younger adolescents is something that I would keep in mind and be more direct or be more concrete, especially when it comes to more severe, symptoms, when it comes to maybe, death thoughts and self-harm. Those are things that I would also include today.
Thank you. One quick observation, and then I am going to turn it over. You found disproportionate representation in mental health problems among females. That's a universal truth. But it's a universal truth probably because of what you look at and not because of females. You looked at depression and anxiety, and the literature is pretty clear that females are internalizers everywhere. Males are externalizers. And it goes back to Professor Kremers' questions as well. But when I think you think about mental health, you need to think about the behavioral issues that are disproportionately male represented, as well as the internalizing conditions of depression, anxiety, which tend to be disproportionately female for a whole host of reasons, some of which you touch on. Let me stop here, back and turn it over.
Thank you very much. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Afifi, professor at University of Iowa, College of Public Health in Iowa City in the United States. Professor Afifi.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I also wanted to congratulate the candidate for all the wonderful work that's been done and the perseverance to put adolescent health on the Saudi Arabian agenda. I'm going to take it from where Professor Bloom started. He was sort of asking you to explain the path to get here. I'm going to ask you about what next. So in almost all of the chapters, you talk about the importance of intervention based on your findings. And so this question, I think, has a bunch of parts. One is, you also talk in all the chapters about the importance of contextualization of those interventions. So what are some of the factors that would influence the contextualization? And you could choose any one of the particular issues or health topics. So if you had an evidence-based intervention that had some evidence behind it somewhere in the world, how would you take that to contextualize it to a particular health issue that you found in your findings? So that's the first part. The second, I think, is related to the really interesting introduction that you gave in your 15 minutes, as well as I think what has already come up in Professor Kremers and Professor Bloom's questions about the interrelationship between the health issues and risk factors. And we are not great in public health or medicine about interventions that take into account interrelationships, other than positive youth development, which is, a general framework to look at things, across issues. We mostly like to do interventions that are very directed at a particular health issue. So sort of considering that, what might be some thoughts on interventions that might take advantage or tackle, that's a violent word, that might take into account, I should say, the interrelationship between health issues and risk factors. Thanks.
Thank you, your highly esteemed opponent. So in terms of what's next, so again, it's looking at the different levels of the ecosystem. And if we start at the top, maybe with policy, adolescent health in all policies is really something that I'm pushing for, let's say. And we are, as a country, we are addressing health in all policies. It's a prominent committee that we have here at the highest level. And so it looks at the cross-sectoral approach. And what I have been, addressing or trying to push forward is having adolescent health in all policies, again, with a cross-sectoral approach. Coming down to the community level, again, school health is another big item on the agenda, where, I hope that we end up having school health and school and university health in all schools and universities in order to address many of these, factors. And then at the more at the individual level or the family level, items with the adolescents themselves, with their parents, and that adolescent-parent relationship is very essential, and as we have seen, is protective, and how can we capitalize on that? With respect to a potential intervention and addressing the interrelationships, and how do we tackle that? It is challenging. However, if we do want to succeed, I think we do need to have this holistic sort of approach to some extent because of the findings that we see. And so an intervention that I often think about is, again, maybe looking at schools as a venue or as a modality, and looking at life skills and having life skills programs which addresses these different variables that are, from a contextual perspective, would be very much acceptable, would be very much, I believe, supported in terms of uptake by families, by schools, by the government. And we could address very specific items in a we should address in a very culturally sensitive manner. I think if we have a life skills approach, we would be able to tackle some of these different items. And hopefully, evaluation is going to be very important, but I would hope to see that with that sort of approach, that we would over time see an impact on at least a couple of different areas.
Thank you for that. I wanted to follow up with a question on surveillance. I know that one of your main goals in developing the survey and starting this was to get to a point where there was a surveillance system in Saudi Arabia related to adolescent health. So what has been the progress on that? And how do you see that happening or not, depending on what's happened so far?
So in terms of the surveillance, so this was the first round, and it continues to be the only round yet of the study. In terms of the national research agenda, and I was very fortunate to be leading the national research agenda on child and adolescent health. And we were able to, as a group, put forward, one of the priorities or one of the suggestions there for adolescent health to include surveillance, to have surveillance, system put in place. Is it doable? Is it feasible? Absolutely, it is feasible. Do we have the infrastructure to do it? And do we have, from a technology perspective, the support, the means to do it? Yes, we do. So it's just a matter of continuing perseverance and pushing forward with that. Having a surveillance system really is, I think about it all the time. It will really support us becoming a learning health system. And again, it's not about the data, but it's what do we do with this data, and learning from that, using that for implementation, and then learning, relearning, and that cycle continues. So perseverance.
Thank you. I'll turn it over back to the Madame Director.
Thank you very much. The opposition will be continued by Professor Firon, Emeritus Professor of Social Medicine at Maastricht University. Professor Firon.
Thank you very much. Dear candidate, first and foremost, I would like to congratulate you on completing your PhD thesis. And I want also to extend my congratulations to your promoter and co-promoter. I have read your thesis with great interest, and the studies as presented in your thesis report on several important specific issues of adolescent health in terms of physical, mental, and social aspects. The content of your thesis contributed to more specific knowledge and awareness on several health issues that are high prevalent in adolescents in your country. So thank you very much for your research. Of course, studying your work also raised some questions, and it's a pleasure for me to have the opportunity to discuss some comments with you. First of all, a very short question. You did not provide information about special needs students. On page 20, paragraph 2.4, you stated that special needs students were excluded. So what I want to know is, what is the approximate proportion of the special needs student population in Saudi Arabia? Because an important point of concern is the question whether the student population of special education schools have even a higher number of unmet needs which require ongoing monitoring and interventions compared to your study population. So the second question is, what was the reason for the exclusion of the special needs students?
Thank you very much, your highly esteemed opponent. Yes, you are absolutely correct. The schools that are specific for special needs students were excluded from this study. Before I address that further, just to put it into context, or to give you a better understanding of the education system here in Saudi Arabia. For children, adolescents with special needs, depending on their needs, those with less, severe developmental needs may be enrolled in mainstream schools. And in that case, they would have been participants in this study because their school would have been eligible. Adolescents and children with more advanced special needs would have different schools which are not within mainstream. And it is those schools that were not included because we know that there are those schools that caters for those with, because they're more severe needs, they may not be able to address or the way we had the study conducted may not be the right format or methodology for them in order for us to address the needs. So that's the reason why special needs schools were excluded. In terms of unmet needs, it's a big, again, we do expect that special needs, young people with special needs do have unmet needs, which may be different, which they might be more severe than the needs that we have identified in this study. We simply don't know because we don't have the evidence to support that. expect that, yes, there would be different needs. And this is why we have recommended that further studies be conducted to address the needs of young individuals with special needs so that we are not excluding them from the bigger picture.
Okay, thank you very much. Then my next question, what I read in your impressive CV, there we can read that about your appointment as the head of the Center of Excellence of the National Family Safety Program. As we all know, the most important aim of the NFSP is to decrease the incidence of child abuse and neglect and to prevent child maltreatment. In this respect, I was surprised, and I must confess also somewhat disappointed, to the fact that child maltreatment, child abuse and neglect is missing in your studies. Nevertheless, I found a lot of factors in your studies that might be predisposing for maltreatment or for neglect or domestic violence or sexual abuse. For instance, what you report on the relationships with the father of adolescents. Same arguments regarding underweight, substance use, sleeping disorders. So the exposure to violence at home actually is missing. And in my opinion, dealing with prevention of maltreatment and abuse of children and adolescents should be one of the operational targets in child and adolescent care. So my question is, why not elaborate on this very important health issue? And would you be so kind to reflect on the Geluna findings regarding this issue?
Thank you very much. Yes, so adolescent maltreatment and child maltreatment are very important, components to address. The reason they were not addressed in this specific study was for ethical purposes, meaning that the concern was if an adolescent did express some sort of maltreatment, we would not be able to help him or her. So it might be more distress. We might, induce some sort of distress, and we would not be able to help them. So it was for that reason, by law, we have to report, these any case of maltreatment in underage individuals. So for this reason, it was not included. Having said this, we did subsequently carry out, during my time at the National Family Safety Program, we did conduct a national study specifically addressing child and adolescent maltreatment, again at the country level. And with that, we have generated some evidence to support that, and we had some parameters in place to support young children and adolescents who did acknowledge or admit that they were exposed to such.
Mm-hmm.
That's certainly an important topic.
Yeah, certainly an important topic, but I was wondering why this happened, because, for instance, on sexual behaviors and STDs, you stated that these items were found to be culturally inappropriate and therefore they were not included, but you didn't mention the violence at home. And on the other hand, you ask questions about alcohol, about the use of illegal substances, and not the violence at home. So it was a pity. I think it's very important to focus on it. I don't know whether there is time for a next question, or
You have some time.
yeah. In your recommendations on page 170, you stated that schools are essential for places for identifying and addressing adolescent health issues. This made me really curious about your opinion how school-related healthcare for adolescents should be organized on the individual level. So my question is, what are your recommendations for real-life practice considering needs and demands of adolescents on the individual level?
Thank you very much for this question. So at the individual level, depending on the available resources within schools, because they are variable. Having said that, meaning what sort of resources are in place in the school. Having said that, there is with our current health system redesign, if you will, we are wanting to ensure that primary care services in the community, that there is some sort of linkage between schools and primary care services. So even if there isn't the full set of resources required at the school, there is some sort of linkage. So at the school level, in terms of identifying possible, concerns or maybe not needs, again, depending to what extent, but as long as we're able to identify areas of concern, or if adolescents are in places where that they feel, psychologically safe and can speak to an individual, and then have that individual, that professional, link them to either an expert or another professional within the school, or link them to someone in the primary care centers or in the community to address their thoughts, is really the thought process behind it. For adolescents with chronic disease, because they have more access to health care facilities, for example, it's an opportunity really to address some of those individual needs in the healthcare facilities. So when they come for their routine follow-up visits every 3 months or so, again, as a checkpoint or as a health check. It's not ideal because they're not as frequent as we would hope, but it's certainly better or more frequent, I would say, than somebody who is maybe a healthier young person who may not be accessing the healthcare system more regularly.
Yeah, thank you very much for your additional clarifications. And for now, I will hand over the floor back to our pro-rector. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then we come to the last opponent of this session, which is Professor Vreugdenhil from Maastricht University Medical Center. Professor Vreugdenhil.
Yeah, dear candidate, first of all, I would like also to congratulate you with the great work that you have completed in the past years, and with the study results that you have captured in this beautiful thesis, but also my compliments for your motivation to address this very important topic and to create awareness. And I think it's not only important for these young people themselves, but also for the next generations, because they are the future moms and dads of our next generations. And of course, I would also like to congratulate your team of supervisors with this beautiful result. So I've read the thesis also with great interest, but actually I was also impressed and a bit depressed because of the very high numbers of obesity and chronic health conditions in your study population of very young people. And your study population was a sample of general population of adolescents, so a mixture of underweight, normal weight, overweight, and obese adolescents. So it's well known that in particular children with overweight and obesity suffer from health conditions such as asthma and diabetes, which was very prevalent in your population, but also mental health problems are related. So I wondered whether you evaluated the distribution of these chronic health conditions in the adolescents with and without overweight. So my question is also whether the high prevalence of this morbidity could be attributed to the high percentage of overweight and obesity in your study population. Have you looked at this?
Thank you very much, your highly esteemed opponent. So the question is with regards to obesity and chronic conditions or chronic health conditions and mental health. So no, we have not looked at that yet. Again, there's so much sub-analyses that can be done from this this whole study, and I have a list of items that I still have not conducted, which are, or we've begun to conduct, but are still, it's work in progress. But this topic about obesity and chronic disease, we have not addressed yet. Obesity as a subtopic is certainly there. When we looked at, on the other hand, when we looked at some of the mental health conditions and obesity or chronic disease, we did see that relationship, there. And this is an area for further work.
So if you expect, I think that is the conclusion, that you expect that it will be an important factor in the health issues that those adolescents have, then my reflex is to think about interventions. And you mentioned that there are conditions in Saudi Arabia that are complicating factors, for instance, the heat outside, or the lack of facilities that impair improvement of physical activity, or lack of physical education of girls, for instance. So considering those complicating factors, how should an intervention look like, to your opinion?
Thank you very much. So again, it would be a combined or an approach where we address these different parameters as opposed to having it in silos. So maybe if we take that same example of the life skills programs that I had mentioned earlier, I think this could be a good venue where we address factors related to eating. We address factors relating to physical activities. Not that adolescents don't know these things. They know a lot about, these things, but how do we put it into a context that might be motivating, for them to make the necessary change? How do we, maybe considering, some of the, the high prevalence of gaming and so on, integrating maybe some of these items in gaming programs or games, but basically having a multi-pronged approach that addresses eating, that addresses physical activity, that addresses sleep, that addresses tobacco and substance use. So many different variables that addresses chronic disease. And, if you have a chronic condition, how do you approach that? What are the things to consider? Access to care. So multiple items in one program, rather than having a single siloed approach.
Okay, thank you. And this kind of interventions now, in the light of the corona pandemic and all its measures, because we have seen that those problems that you describe in your thesis increased, in the Netherlands at least. Obesity and lifestyle behavior is worsened. So do you know of any studies in Saudi Arabia, and how should, in the light of the corona pandemic, interventions look like during lockdowns or even after lockdowns, because the problems have increased tremendously? And I heard you said we have to act now in your introduction, but I think based on the current increase in problems, I think it now really is time to act. So what should we do now, considering the situation that we are in?
Thank you very much. And yes, we do have evidence. We've conducted a study, which is, we still haven't published it yet, but again, looking at the impact of the COVID and adolescent lifestyle. So we do see this deterioration in lifestyle. So worsening eating habits, as reported by adolescents, changes in their weight, more with weight gain, more of mental health symptoms. So yes, there is a true problem. How do we address it now? We've learned so much from the pandemic, for better or for worse. And for what we have seen is that the whole education systems have turned to online systems. Whether they are effective or not is a different discussion, but there is a means to do it, and so we can still conduct or hold interventions and conduct them via digital technologies. We could, again, I always like to think about what do young people and what would they enjoy in order to get them on board, and they love to play these video games. So gaming approaches, I think, are areas that we need to think about implementing or integrating some of these interventions through gaming approaches, so that hopefully we could have a better or higher uptake.
Okay, thank you. I think this really is a way to go. But I also saw that the soft drink consumption in adolescents in Saudi Arabia is very high, almost 90% I saw, and energy drinks 40%. It's impressive. So that's a bad thing, but it's also hopeful because we know a lot of literature that if you diminish sugar sweetened beverage, that it really has an impact on weight. Our government just decided to implement a sugar tax. What do you think about the sugar tax? What are the pros and the cons of that?
So we've implemented measures.
Fadia AlBuhairan,
Yes.
the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request that you and the other members of the audience await the results of our deliberations and our return. Fadia AlBuhairan, the degree committee here present online has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor De Vries is authorized to confirm upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor now to take the floor.
But first, we will ask you a question. Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I do promise.
Good. Then by the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present online, I hereby confer upon you, Fadia AlBuhairan, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached to this by custom and law. As evidence of this, you will soon receive the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the supervisor, and affixed with the official seal of our university, as shown now by the beadle. And I think this is a moment for a small applause. Now, Dr. AlBuhairan, you may have seen that the subtitle in your image has now changed. And I want to offer you my heartfelt congratulations with obtaining your doctorate. It's customary that the promoter says some words of praise after this graduation, but in your case, words can hardly be enough. Of course, you should be proud of yourself, but honestly, I should be proud and honored that you asked me to be your promoter, and I'll try to explain this a little bit further. For me, this all started early in the previous decade, when you sent me a proposal for a study about the health situation and risk factors concerning non-communicative disease of adolescents in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Such data were not available, and you, a pediatrician, had the idea that it was of ultimate importance to follow the youth in order to create curative and especially preventive policies. This developed into GLUNA, basically a needs assessment or surveillance instrument with data from 12,500 participants. I remember discussing the list of variables to be included and you giving me already at that time lessons on cultural appropriateness. GLUNA has proven to be a very rich source, apparent from all the topics that you cover in your thesis: dietary factors, physical activity, including sedentary behavior, leading to over and underweight, body image, bullying, physical violence, substance use, mental health, sleep, academic performance. The list is not even complete. So when you came to visit me, you were a pediatrician working in a hospital. I then did not realize that you were the power woman that you turned out to be. I found it brave to enter just into a PhD trajectory. But this was only the start of the PhD. You really became a pioneer and leader in adolescent health, not only because of the research that you report in your thesis, but also as a practitioner first, as a pediatrician, but later as a policymaker. You broadened the scope of pediatrics in KSA from care for children only up to an age of 12 to the age of 18, including adolescent health, and recognizing that there are different phases during lifespan, even before adulthood. So in the period since we met, you held functions as a pediatrician, as a head of pediatrics, as adult and adolescent health, of course, as chief medical officer, and now as an advisor to the health sector transformation program in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Apart from that, your open eye for the topic of women's health will also be of value there. So you've moved from practice in medicine to policy development and advice. Quite a development, and also providing the opportunity, I think, for developing interventions. Also, you perform functions in WHO and in the International Association for Adolescent Health, leading the Middle East and North Africa section. Meanwhile, you obtained a master's degree in public health and developed competencies in health finance and management. You held professorships at different institutions, undoubtedly inspiring colleagues and students over there as well. And then the research bit. Your CV now lists 46 peer-reviewed papers, including Lancet and Nature, to mention only a few of those outlets, 3 books, different chapters, numerous presentations and contributions to conferences. So that is the power woman that stepped into my office. When I explained at that time that the PhD in the Netherlands would require more than the production of one epidemiological and a methodological chapter, you did not shy away at all. And now we find a thesis that contains 6 empirical chapters and 9 in total, far above average, I'd say. Actually, you did not even need me for these. Most of the papers I've not even been a co-author on. And still, they have all, of course, except the introduction and the general discussion, been published in good journals. Today, again, you showed your mastery and energy while defending your work. So, Fadia, it is indeed an honor that you chose Maastricht University and me as a supervisor for your PhD. Our contacts have always been pleasant. You have been very patient with me, not in the medical meaning, of course, but patient anyway. And today this trajectory ends. But I hope that it also will be the beginning of a new working relation. It's unfortunate that we could not meet physically for this occasion and also talk about the next phase, but I'm sure we will make up some other time. I wish you all possible success in the future, and I'm sure you will continue to be impactful and a role model for many. Okay, having said all this, I would like to thank the co-promoter, Professor Makzoub, for his willingness to take up that role and his contributions. And of course, I also thank the degree committee, Professors Kremers, Firon, and Vreugdehill from Maastricht University, and especially Professor Afifi from the University of Iowa and Professor Bloom from Johns Hopkins. Thank you for your willingness and for your time. Finally, Fadia, Dr. AlBuhairan, I congratulate you again, and I would like to extend my congratulations to your family, husband, kids, parents, and other relatives. I know some of those have been sent away from home to witness this ceremony from elsewhere, but I'm sure the new, as we call that, a young daughter will join soon for celebrations. I wish you a very good day, and now I return the floor to the pro-rector.
Thank you very much. Dear Dr. AlBuhairan, also on behalf of the Board of Deans of Maastricht University, I'd like to congratulate you with the honor you have acquired. You did very well during the defense. You've shown us that you have a broad knowledge of the topic, and you really deserve the degree. I also like to congratulate your family and your friends and colleagues. Of course, I also like to congratulate your supervisors with this degree. And I would like to thank all the Corona members for being present during this defense and their stimulating questions. I hereby declare this ceremony to be ended.